In a medieval house, one lump of dough never got baked. Every week, when bread was made, the baker tore off a fist of raw dough and set it aside instead of baking it. That piece was fed a little flour and water, kept warm and guarded. Because that lump was alive, and it was the only thing in the whole house that could make tomorrow's bread rise. There was no shop to run to. Yeast in a packet would not exist for centuries. The most valuable thing in that kitchen was not the flour, and it was not the oven. It was a living thing the family could not afford to let die. Today we are going to raise one medieval loaf from nothing but flour, water, salt and thyme. And by the end you will see why that lump was treated like a member of the family, and how it ended up buried inside the words Lord and Lady. Keep that one in mind. So start where a medieval baker actually had to start, which is with a real and stubborn problem. Put flour, water and a pinch of salt together, and you get a flat, heavy paste, and left alone that paste bakes into something closer to a roof tile than to bread. There is no yeast to stir in. There is no little sachet, no dried granules, no baking soda, none of the things a modern kitchen reaches for without a second thought. The question the entire medieval world had to answer then, every single week, in every single house, was blunt and enormous. How do you make that dead flat paste rise? And the answer, the first solution, is one of the strangest facts in the whole history of food. You do almost nothing, and you wait. Leave a bowl of flour and water sitting out in a warm kitchen, and within a few days it begins to change entirely on its own. It bubbles. It swells and softens. It gives off a sharp, sour, faintly beery smell. Nobody has added a single thing to it. What is happening is that wild yeasts and bacteria, which are already living on the grain itself and drifting invisibly in the air of the room, have woken up in all that wet flour, started to feed, and begun breathing out gas. That gas, trapped in the stretchy dough, is what lifts it. The medieval baker could not have told you one word of that explanation. Nobody would even see a single yeast cell under a lens for centuries yet. But they did not need the science, because they had watched the result happen 10,000 times over. Leave the paste in the warm, and the paste comes alive. That living, bubbling, sour mixture had a name. They called it the leaven. And here is a detail that delights the people who still bake this way today. No two leavens were ever quite the same. The particular mix of wild yeasts and bacteria that settled into a given kitchen depended on that kitchen, on its air and its grain and its warmth. So a leaven raised in one village genuinely tasted different from a leaven 2 valleys over. Every household was, without ever meaning to, cultivating a flavour that belonged to it alone. But a fresh leaven caught out of thin air is slow, and worse than slow, it is unreliable. It can take the better part of a week to get going, and sometimes it does not get going properly at all, or it sours and spoils before it ever does its job. No family that needed bread on the table every week could afford to gamble on catching a brand new one from the air each time. And so that first solution exposed the second problem the very moment it started working. Once you finally have a living leaven that behaves, how do you make absolutely sure you never lose it again? And this is where that fist of dough from the very beginning comes back around. The solution was simple, and it was quietly brilliant. You never start from scratch a second time. Every time you make bread, before you bake, you tear off a piece of the living, risen dough, and you hold it back. You feed it a little flour and water. You keep it warm and covered. And that saved piece becomes the seed of next week's bread, and the week after that, and the season after that, and on without end. In French kitchens, the saved piece was called the chef, the chief, the head of the dough. In English homes, it was just the leaven, kept alive on its shelf by the fire. It had stopped being something you made and become something you owned and maintained. exactly like a hearth fire you took care never to let go out. And people treated it that way. In some households, the same leaven was passed from a mother to her daughter when the daughter married, handed over as part of her dowry alongside the linen and the pots. A good, strong, reliable starter could be inherited like a family heirloom, because in every sense that mattered, that is precisely what it was. A whole village might be eating bread that traced back, unbroken, to a handful of original leavens kept going for lifetimes. People carried these leavens with them too. A family moving to a new holding, or later crossing an ocean to a new country entirely, would often take a portion of the living starter along, tucked into a crock and fed on the road, so that the very first bread baked in the new home still carried the taste of the old one. The leaven was a thread of continuity you could hold in your two hands. Now, keeping a living thing alive is its own kind of work, and that is the third problem in the chain. A leaven is not a jar of dried powder that waits patiently in a cupboard. It is a colony of living organisms, and it can starve if you forget to feed it, drown if you add too much water, sour itself past the point of any use if you leave it standing too long, or die outright in a hard winter frost. The medieval household had to fold the care of it right into the rhythm of the week, feeding it, warming it, and catching it at the exact right moment, risen and active, but not yet turned. And that famous sourness people associate with this bread was the bacteria working away alongside the yeast. A little of that acid gave the loaf its pleasant tang, and, just as importantly, helped it keep for longer without spoiling. Too much of it made the bread sharp, harsh, and barely eatable. Reading that balance by smell and by the feel of the dough, with no thermometer and no clock to help, was a genuine skill, and a good baker was quietly and rightly proud of it. Households learned tricks for the dangerous months too. In deep winter, the crock lived close to the banked fire, wrapped up like something newborn, and in the coldest houses the leaven was buried inside the flour barrel itself, insulated by the very grain it would one day raise. Losing it did not just cost you a loaf. It cost you the week or more it took to catch and prove a new one, eating flatbread the whole way. There was even a shortcut for any household that also brewed its own ale, which was a great many of them. The thick foam that rose on top of fermenting ale was absolutely loaded with living yeast. Skimmed off the top of the brewing barrel, that foam, which was called barm, could be stirred straight into fresh dough to raise it fast. The alehouse and the bakery, it turns out, were quietly running on the very same invisible engine. The alewife brewing in one corner of the village and the baker working in another were both, without knowing it, farming the same microscopic life, and people simply used whichever source of it they happened to have to hand. In many towns, the barm itself became a small trade. Brewers and alewives would sell or hand off their surplus foam to neighbours and to bakers, so that the yeast quite literally circulated through the community, from the brewing barrel to the breadboard. A baker on good terms with a busy brewhouse never had to worry about a sluggish leaven, and the bread that barm raised had its own lighter, slightly different character. And before that dough ever gets near an oven, this is the moment to stop and really look at what that shelf lump actually was, because it is easy to walk right past how strange it is. The truth is that leaven was almost never just a few weeks old. In a settled, careful household it could be years old, and often it was generations old, the very same unbroken living colony, fed and carried forward, and never once allowed to die, in many cases older than the oldest person in the house, and older than the walls standing around it. You were not baking with an ingredient at all. You were baking with a lineage. And that long, slow life did something to the bread that a modern loaf skips over entirely. Across the many hours, sometimes a full day and night, that the dough sat quietly fermenting, the acids and the wild organisms in it were steadily breaking down the toughest, hardest parts of the grain, long before anyone took a bite. The bread was, in a real and literal sense, already part digested before it ever reached the mouth. Now hold that picture up against a loaf from a modern supermarket. Since the early 1960s, most of the bread sold across Britain has been made by an industrial process that mixes the dough at high speed with a large added dose of manufactured yeast and turns raw flour into a wrapped sliced loaf in roughly 3.5 hours, start to finish. What the medieval kitchen achieved across a slow day and a living lineage, the modern plant now does before lunch. Neither one is evil, but they are plainly not the same thing, and the real difference between them is not nostalgia. It is time. If watching this makes you want to actually try it for yourself, you are far from the first, and it is more within reach than it probably looks. And that is the whole idea behind the Medieval Way store. It begins with the Medieval Bakery Collection. The Sourdough Manual walks you through building and keeping a living leaven of your own, exactly the way these households did it. The Practical Recipes book takes you through the loaves themselves, step by step, and the Sourcing Guide points you to the right heritage grain to bake them with. It is history you can keep alive on your own shelf. But we ran ahead of the loaf itself, because that perfectly risen dough still had to be baked, and the bake was the last problem in the whole chain. Raw dough is still raw. To turn it into bread, you need serious, sustained, even heat held steady for a good while, and that is something a poor medieval household very often simply did not have. A proper bread oven was a large and expensive piece of masonry, and an open fire hot enough to bake was a serious danger that could burn a whole street of timber and thatch houses to the ground. The great majority of ordinary peasants, therefore, did not own an oven at all. The answer was that most people did not bake at home. You carried your risen loaves, often marked with your own family sign so you could tell them apart, to a communal oven, and in a great many places that oven belonged to the lord of the manor. You paid him for the right to use it, in coin, or more often in a set share of your own bread or flour. It was the very same kind of binding arrangement that tied a whole village to the lord's mill for its grinding, and villagers resented the oven for exactly the same reasons they resented the mill. But the oven itself was a genuinely clever machine. You lit a roaring fire inside the stone chamber and let it burn hard until the walls and floor were searing hot right through. Then you raked out every last coal and sweep of ash, slid your loaves directly onto the bare blazing stone floor, and sealed the door tight. The bread then baked in the stored heat radiating out of the masonry itself, fierce at the start and gently fading over the hours, which happens to be exactly the heat curve a good loaf wants. And judging that heat was pure craft, because there was no dial to read and no number to trust. A baker learned to test the oven by holding a bare arm inside it and counting the seconds before it grew unbearable, or by flicking a pinch of flour across the floor and watching how quickly it browned. Too hot and the crust burned black while the middle stayed raw and wet. Too cool and the loaf came out pale, dense and heavy. On baking day, the smell of hot bread rolled out through the whole village, and everyone knew the oven was running. For most people, the result was a large, round, dark loaf of maslin, that everyday mix of wheat and rye, with a thick and chewy crust. The fine, pale, soft white loaf, the manchet, was strictly a rich person's bread, and a day-old trencher, a thick slab of stale bread used as an edible plate to soak up the juices and sauces of a meal, was the medieval answer to washing the dishes. Bread this central to survival was also, unsurprisingly, one of the first things the authorities ever thought to regulate. In medieval England, there was an actual law fixing the weight and the price of a loaf against the going price of grain, one of the oldest consumer protection laws we know of. A baker caught selling a light loaf, A loaf that weighed less than the law demanded for its price could be dragged through the streets, pilloried, and publicly shamed, sometimes with the offending loaf hung around his neck. The punishments were harsh enough that, according to the story that has come down to us, bakers took to throwing in a 13th loaf with every dozen, purely to make certain they could never be accused of shorting a customer. That, so it is said, is where the baker's dozen of 13 comes from. Whether or not that neat origin is the true one, it tells you exactly how seriously the medieval world took the weight of its daily bread. This was not a snack. This was the line between a fed family and a hungry one. But keeping that leaven going was never really only about the bread, and this is where you pick that thread back up, the one from the very start of this video, because the importance of bread ran far deeper into the medieval world than any recipe. Bread was not one item among many in that world. Bread was the very centre of the household, the thing that everything else quietly revolved around, and the language itself proves it in a way that genuinely surprises most people the first time they hear it. Take the word Lord. It comes down to us from an old word that meant, quite literally, the loaf guardian, the keeper and protector of the bread. The man at the head of the household was defined, in the very word for his rank, as the one who held and guarded the loaf. Now take the word lady. It comes from an old word meaning the one who kneaded the loaf, the shaper of the bread. And the ordinary dependents of a great house, the people who worked in exchange for a place at its table, were described in the oldest terms of all as the loaf eaters. Stop for a second and really hear what that means. The entire vocabulary of rank and power in the early medieval world, the lord above, the lady beside him, the people below, was built up out of a single basic question. Who guards the bread? Who makes the bread? And who eats it? That is not some accident of old spelling. That is an entire society telling you, in its own most fundamental words, that everything traced back to the loaf. Which is exactly why that unbaked fist of dough on the shelf mattered as much as it did. It was never just a clever cooking trick. It was the living heart of a home that was organised, from the top of it, right down to the bottom, around bread. Guarding it, feeding it, and keeping it alive from one generation to the next was not a small domestic chore. In a world where the very words for your own rulers were built out of the word for a loaf, keeping the leaven alive was very nearly the same act as keeping the household itself alive. So there is your loaf, and there is the thing that truly raised it, not a packet, not a powder. A living colony, often older than the oven that baked it, carried forward by hand across the years, sitting at the exact centre of medieval life. Would you keep a leaven of your own alive? Tell me below, subscribe for more forgotten history, and I will see you next time.